Remember this face. This is the face of a monster. The events of this video are very real and extremely heartbreaking. You're about to learn of a psychopath who used and manipulated women to live a fake life full of luxury. Cecilia Felihoy sat in her London apartment swiping left and right on Tinder. It was a cool January evening in 2018 when she came across the profile of a man named Simon Leviev. He was handsome, well-traveled, and checked all the boxes for a good online dating profile. Cecilia thought he looked interesting, so she swiped right. It was an instant match. She continued browsing profiles on Tinder for a few more minutes when her new match Simon messaged her. He told Cecilia he was in town for business, but would love to take her out for coffee to get to know her better. Without even being asked, Simon sent his location. He was staying at the Four Seasons Hotel in London. Cecilia was intrigued, so she Googled Simon Leviev to make sure he wasn't a wanted felon or trying to catfish her. What she found was an active Instagram page and a diamond company that included his last name. He seemed normal enough, so she agreed to meet with her new match to see if anything would come of it. Knowing Simon needed to leave later that night for business, Cecilia quickly changed and got ready for the date. She took a cab to the Four Seasons and stepped inside of the luxurious lobby. Cecilia messaged Simon that she was there as she took a seat on one of the comfortable cushioned chairs. She waited patiently for Simon to respond, but no new messages came through. Cecilia heard the elevator door chime. At that same moment, Simon messaged her saying that he was just stepping into the lobby. She looked up and saw the man she had matched with on Tinder. He looked exactly like his pictures. He was dressed in designer clothes and had a swagger associated with money and power. Cecilia was impressed, and as they got to know one another, she got more and more enchanted by Simon Leviev. The night went on. Simon continuously asked Cecilia about herself and listened intently. He made it seem like he honestly cared about what she had to say, but time was running out. Simon needed to leave for a meeting in Sofia, Bulgaria. Cecilia's heart sank when Simon told her he had to go. She was actually enjoying herself. Then something unexpected happened. Simon asked Cecilia if she wanted to go with him to Bulgaria on his private jet so they could continue to get to know one another. She paused for a moment and realized that this was the chance of a lifetime. Simon had told her he worked in the diamond business and that, in fact, he was the Prince of Diamonds. What he meant by this was that his father was a man named Lev Avnerovich Leviev. Simon showed Cecilia a photoshopped picture of him and his father. Lev was known around the world as the King of Diamonds, as he owned one of the most lucrative companies in the world called LLD Diamonds. Lev was close with friends with colorful characters like Vladimir Putin and Angolan President Jose Eduardo dos Santos. He was also very, very rich. This explained how Simon could afford all the luxuries he had shown Cecilia thus far. Cecilia agreed to go with Simon. He had a Rolls-Royce chauffeur drive her back to her house to pick up a few things and then to the airport. Although when she arrived at the small airport and met back up with Simon, she was surprised to find that his ex-wife and child would be joining them. Simon told Cecilia not to worry about it as it was his turn to spend some time with his daughter, and they would be going on their own way once they reached Bulgaria. Cecilia had told her friends where she was going, and they had mixed reactions. Some were excited, others were nervous since she had only just met Simon. But in the end, Cecilia got on the plane and flew across the English Channel with Simon, his family, and an entourage of people consisting of a business partner and Simon's bodyguard, Pyotr. Simon told Cecilia more about his life and how dangerous the diamond business could be, but at the same time it provided the means for a lifestyle filled with travel, adventure, and the finest things life had to offer. They drank champagne on the private jet while eating caviar. When the plane landed, Cecilia, Simon, and a few others continued on to the night scene. It was an unforgettable evening, and more money was spent than Cecilia could even fathom. That night, Simon took Cecilia back to the hotel they were staying in, and they spent the night together. Everything seemed to be going well. It was almost too good to be true. Simon paid for Cecilia's return ticket home, and she flew back to London. She had a sneaky suspicion that this was a one-time deal and she would never hear from Simon again. At least it would have been a good story. But then her phone chimed. She checked the message, and it was from Simon. He said he had a wonderful night and would love to spend more time with her. Cecilia got butterflies in her stomach. Maybe this would develop into a relationship, or perhaps she'd finally found the one. For several days, Cecilia and Simon messaged back and forth. He would send her his location so she could follow him around Europe, telling her that he missed her and wanted to see her soon. They would use WhatsApp to send voice messages, text one another good morning and good night, and even talk about love. Simon told Cecilia that he missed her so much that he had to see her. He was back in London and sent Cecilia his location so she could join him. They spent the night together and continued traveling to other destinations as he conducted his business. Things were becoming serious. In fact, Simon even asked Cecilia to be his girlfriend, making things official. It was a fairy tale. Simon was a rich prince who treated Cecilia with respect and love. After several weeks of dating, Simon suggested they get an apartment together and gave Cecilia a budget of $15,000 a month for a London flat. Cecilia toured different apartments, sometimes taking videos to send to Simon and other times having him on a video call so he could see the places. They hadn't settled on an apartment yet, but they were close. Everything was perfect, or so it seemed. Simon had been telling Cecilia more and more frequently that his enemies were out to get him, and that's why he was constantly on the move. Being in the diamond industry was a dangerous game as the workers were people stripped of their basic human rights, slaving in the mines as indentured servants, while people like Simon's so-called father were generating billions of dollars on the global market. Simon told Cecilia he needed to avoid leaving a digital trail that his enemies could follow. But things were going well still. Simon even met Cecilia in her home city of Oslo, Norway, where they spent time together eating at fancy restaurants and seeing the sights. However, at the end of this trip, Simon asked Cecilia for something. He tells her that he needs her to take out a new credit card that he can also use. This is so he can pay for things while traveling and conducting business deals, but since it'll be in Cecilia's name, his enemies won't be able to track him. Cecilia is slightly uncomfortable with this idea, but she loves Simon and agrees. He quickly maxes out the card, but immediately sends Cecilia money to pay it off. Yet after a few days, the card was put on hold as it became maxed out again. This makes Cecilia nervous, but Simon has a solution. He makes Cecilia an employee of LLD Diamonds and sets her salary at almost $100,000. He then provides documentation of the hire, which allows her to increase the spending limit on the Amex card that she had gotten for Simon. Things were beginning to look up. She also got to spend more time with Simon in Amsterdam, where he assured her everything was fine. As of March 2018, Cecilia Fjellhoy was happy and she thought she had the best boyfriend in the world. At that very same time, Pernilla Swilholm was swiping on Tinder in Stockholm, Sweden. She was intrigued by a profile of a man that appeared to be constantly on an adventure and enjoying life to its fullest. This was what she'd been looking for after divorcing her husband of 8 years, so she swiped right. It was a match. A few minutes later, she received a message from the man. His name was Simon Leviev. Pernilla talked to Simon for a little while and found him to be an exciting and nice guy. He told her he'd fly her to Amsterdam where they could go on a date. She agreed and took the trip. Once in Amsterdam, Pernilla met up with Simon. They immediately had a connection, but it wasn't a romantic one. When Simon made a move, they both agreed that they liked one another, but there was no physical attraction, so they would just remain friends. They went out partying and even continued to travel together on and off for several weeks. Simon brought Pernilla with him on his private jet as they flew to Mykonos, Rome, and other party destinations around Europe. For months they hung out together. Pernilla even met Simon's new girlfriend, but this woman was not Cecilia Fjellhoy. Cecilia was still under the impression that she and Simon were exclusive, and rightfully so, as Simon continually sent her texts and messages telling her that he loved her and wanted to have children with her. He was doing all of this while partying it up around Europe and hooking up with girls across the region. As March came to an end and April of 2018 began, Cecilia was getting a little nervous. She hadn't been seeing Simon that much recently, even though they still talked every day. On top of that, the credit card companies were hounding her to pay the bills, but she didn't have the cash. Simon kept promising more money was coming in, but things were difficult right now as his enemies were ramping up their tactics and things were becoming more dangerous. Then, one night while Cecilia was laying in bed in her London apartment, her phone started to go crazy. It was Simon. He was sending her pictures of his bodyguard Piotr and him covered in blood. Simon said they were all right, but they were attacked by his enemies. Cecilia immediately began to panic and asked if it was okay and if there was anything she could do. Simon confirmed he was all right, but he needed to get away, and he couldn't access any of his money without putting his life at risk. So Simon asked Cecilia for $20,000, which would help him reach safety. Cecilia did not have that kind of money, but she desperately wanted to aid her boyfriend. Simon asked her to take out a loan, which she did. In the next few days, Simon told Cecilia he needed more help. She took out another loan and another and another. Cecilia now had compiled hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans and debts, but Simon assured her that he would send her the money as soon as he could get to safety. And from everything she'd seen and known about Simon, he appeared to have plenty of money to pay her back with. Weeks went by and Simon was still asking Cecilia for money. She was so afraid of taking out more loans that she asked Simon to just meet her in Oslo so they could be together and figure everything out while they stayed with her family. This was when things went from bad to worse. Simon began to become colder towards Cecilia. He told her the money was coming but didn't use the same affectionate tone or messages of the previous months. Simon eventually sent Cecilia a picture for a larger deposit of money into her account to cover the debt. A wave of relief washed over her. Cecilia went back to the bank to check on the transfer, but it hadn't gone through yet. She went a couple of days later, but there was still no transfer. A few days after that, the bank informed her that there was no transfer in the first place. Cecilia called Simon, who began yelling at her that he had sent the money and there was nothing else he could do. It was now clear to Cecilia that their relationship was over, but something more sinister was going on. In a panic, she flew to Oslo to be with her mother. Her heart was broken, and every time she thought about the $200,000 in debt she owed to different banks and creditors, she felt nauseous. Her life had been ruined by Simon Leviev. Cecilia worked through the list of creditors to try to tell them what happened. When she speaks to an American Express representative, there's a pause. The representative informs her the agents will be coming to visit her and talk to her about the debt. During the meeting, the agents asked to see a picture of the man she claimed to have her take out all the loans. She shows them a picture of Simon. "That's the guy," one of the agents says. The agents inform Cecilia that she was not the first woman who had been conned by her ex-boyfriend and that his name wasn't always Simon Leviev. They don't know exactly who he is, but her story is similar to the several other women throughout Europe. Yet, police had been unable or unwilling to arrest the man. Cecilia was devastated. She would never be able to pay back all the debt she owed, and there would be no money coming from her former boyfriend, whoever he was. She spiraled into a deep, dark depression. After some time, Cecilia decided something must be done. If Simon could swindle her and the other women out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, he would never stop until he was caught. She contacted the English and Norwegian police, but neither were any help as she didn't know the man's real identity, and in the eye of the law, he hadn't technically done anything illegal, since she was the one who took out all the loans and credit cards. This would be a common occurrence throughout the race to catch Simon Leviev before he destroyed another life. Just because something he did was immoral doesn't mean it was illegal, which may be one of the most frustrating parts of this nightmare. Cecilia decided to take her story to one of the biggest media outlets in Norway, VG. When she told them her story, they asked for evidence. The paper couldn't conduct an investigation or write a piece without a lot of evidence to support her claims. Luckily, Cecilia had all of the texts, photos, and voice memos that Simon sent from their entire relationship. It was more than enough for VG to launch an investigation. What they found was startling. During this time, Pernilla Fjørholm was still talking to and traveling with Simon Leviev as they partied their way around different countries. She had no idea the man was lying about who he was and that he wasn't actually a billionaire. Simon would pay for everyone's drinks, food, and transportation every night they were together. They rented expensive cars and flew everywhere on private jets. The hotels they stayed at were all 5-star, and everyone who worked for the hotel seemed to know who he was. Yet everything he had and everything he did was paid for by someone else. This was the con. Simon Leviev would meet women on Tinder, build relationships, and show them amazing times using money from other women he swindled. Like Cecilia Fjellhøy, he was always on the move and had been using this scheme for years successfully. Countless women had fallen victim to this monster. VG journalists discovered that a man matching Simon's description was sentenced to 2 years in a Finnish prison for conning and stealing from 3 women. The description of how he did it was almost identical to what happened to Cecilia. They followed up with the Finnish police and major newspapers and found that when he was released in 2017, the man went back to Israel where he was originally from. This gave the reporters at VG enough to go on and try and locate Simon's family to figure out his true identity. They booked a flight to Israel and made contact with one of the best investigative journalists in the country, Uri Blau. Uri went through old court records and discovered that the man who changed his name to Simon Leviev was previously Shimon Hayut. Accompanied by Uri, the investigators located Hayut's childhood home. They met someone who claimed to be Hayut's mother, but she hadn't seen or spoken to her son in years after all the lies and cheating. They had definitely found their man. Israeli police had a warrant out for his arrest after he skipped out on a court hearing, but Simon had fled the country with a fake passport, and they did not have the jurisdiction or the ability to locate him in Europe. It was time for the journalist to return home and think of another way to catch Shimon Hayut before he could swindle any more women. At the same time the VG journalists were trying to track down Hayut, Simon had run out of cash again and needed to find another source of money so he could continue his made-up life as a billionaire son. He reached out to his good friend Pernilla. He sent her texts and messages identical to the ones he sent to Cecilia about him and his bodyguard being attacked. Pernilla was scared for Simon and asked how she could help. Simon told her he needed money to quickly escape his enemies, but he would pay her back as soon as he was safe. Pernilla had been saving to buy a house, but she felt that her friend should come first. Besides, she knew Simon was good for the money, since he'd been flying her everywhere and spending tens of thousands of dollars on expensive hotels, yachts, and cars. Pernilla gave Simon access to around $50,000. He used it to buy plane tickets, which she was able to track through her bank statements. But Simon didn't just buy one ticket, he was buying tickets for multiple people she didn't know. It appeared that Simon wasn't running so much as traveling around and partying with other women. Pernilla became suspicious and incredibly nervous. She pressured Simon to pay her back, but he became agitated. The journalists at VG had been going through Cecilia's bank records. They came across a name on multiple plane tickets that Simon had bought using Cecilia's money. The tickets were for a woman named Pernilla Fjellhøy. They reached out to Pernilla. While on the phone with VG, she started to panic as she realized she would never get the money she lent Simon back. She was devastated but also incredibly pissed off. Pernilla decided to help VG get pictures of Simon and uncover the truth about the Tinder swindler. Pernilla reached out to Simon and told him she really needed the money. Simon comforted her and said to meet him in Munich, where he would give her a watch that was worth $100,000. Pernilla already assumed the watch was a fake, just like everything else about Simon, but she agreed to go to Munich anyway to set Simon up so VG could photograph him. Pernilla paid for her own flight. Simon was waiting for her with his designer clothes and an expensive car when she landed. They went to dinner with Simon's entourage. The entire time, Pernilla was keeping the VG reporters updated on their whereabouts. As Simon and Pernilla stepped out of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel where they had dinner, VG finally got their first footage of the man who had been destroying people's lives. Simon looked up at the building across the street and spotted the cameramen. He yelled at everyone to get into their cars and move. He told Pernilla it was his enemies, but she already knew it was the VG photographers. The cars raced through the city of Munich at extreme speeds. Pernilla feared for her life, so she told Simon she wanted to get out as soon as they slowed down. The car pulled over and Pernilla got a cab back to the airport. She next went to Oslo to the VG headquarters. Before going there, though, she had the watch that Simon gave her checked by an expert. It was a fake. She had no way to pay off her debt. With VG journalists present, Pernilla called Simon to confront him. She told him she knew everything and that what he was doing was beyond messed up. Simon lost his mind on the phone and threatened her as he had threatened Cecilia when she tried to comfort him. VG recorded the whole thing. VG brought together Cecilia and Pernilla to corroborate stories and to commiserate over the psychopath who had cost them so much money and emotional trauma. As in Cecilia's case, the authorities were less helpful to Pernilla since they didn't know where Simon was and weren't sure he had done anything illegal. It was incredibly frustrating, but the two women had an immediate bond and agreed to let VG publish everything they had uncovered, even the most personal details. VG released the Tinder Swindler article in the following year in February 2019. During this time, more and more women had come forward to tell their stories about how Simon Leviev had tricked them and stolen their money. But these weren't just isolated cases. Apparently, Simon had stolen from families, businesses, and other women around the world. He was truly a terrible person. Eileen Charlotte sat on a runway waiting for her plane to take off for Amsterdam to visit her boyfriend. As she scrolled through social media, an image of her boyfriend came up, except it wasn't an Instagram post. It was the cover photo for the VG Tinder Swindler article. Eileen's stomach contorted as she scrolled through the article. She couldn't believe what she was reading. She had met Simon Leviev on Tinder. She had been dating him for over a year. She had loaned him over $100,000. She felt like she was going to throw up. Just before the plane took off, Eileen messaged Simon the article. When she landed, Simon left countless messages and voicemails saying it was all a lie made up by his enemies. Eileen wasn't so sure. She loved Simon, but there was so much evidence against him. She needed time. All the stories that were told about private planes and fancy hotels were exactly what Simon had done with her. Every piece of evidence was pointing to Eileen's boyfriend being an awful human being. As the plane taxied to the gate in Amsterdam, Eileen called the police. But like all the previous times, they said there was nothing they could do unless she had hard evidence that Simon had committed a prosecutable crime. In a split-second decision, Eileen decided she would take matters into her own hands. She knew that with the article out for the world to see, Simon would not be able to easily swindle anyone else on Tinder for money. She was his only hope. When he picked her up, Eileen told Simon she believed him and that the women in the article were lying, but she really knew the truth. Eileen pretended that she was still in love with Simon all night long, but in reality she hated his guts. She was disgusted every time he touched her, but she put up with his hugs and affection just to sell the plan. The night finally ended and Eileen got back on a plane to return home, but not before she convinced Simon to give her some of his most expensive designer clothes to sell for quick cash. If nothing else, Simon's clothes were real, and Eileen knew she could sell them for quite a bit of money. Simon agreed, and they loaded suitcases full of his clothing. He told Eileen he had slipped a note into her bag. As she read it, she was filled with disgust. Simon said he loved her and wanted to have babies with her, but it was just the desperate plea of a sad little man whose con was up. Eileen had no intention of ever sending Simon money. She sold the clothes on eBay and kept the profits to recoup some of her losses. She would never be able to make back all the money she had lent to Simon. But there was something cathartic about selling his clothes and knowing he was stuck without any way out of the hole he dug for himself. When Simon realized that Eileen had played him, he left her threatening messages, but then he would immediately call back and apologize. He was no longer the Prince of Diamonds, but the king of leftover food and homelessness. The Tinder swindler had been swindled. But he was still a free man even if he had nothing. Simon had begged Eileen to buy him a plane ticket from Prague where he was hiding. Obviously, she refused. She had informed the police where Simon was, but they didn't seem interested in catching him. So, once again, Eileen took matters into her own hands. She knew that Simon was trying to get out of Europe. She also had seen a credit card with the name David Sharon on it. Eileen had a hunch that this was going to be his new alias so that he could get out of the country and continue tricking people under a different identity. Eileen periodically checked her messages to make sure Simon didn't get away. One day she noticed something weird. Simon was offline. He was never offline. This could only mean he was on an airplane, and he somehow managed to get the money to leave Prague. Eileen had remembered Simon mentioning something about Greece, so she checked the day's flights from Prague to Athens. There was just one about the time that Simon went inactive. She called the police and Interpol hotlines and left messages that Simon Leviev was using David Sharon as a fake name and identity. Assuming a false identity to fly across borders was most certainly a prosecutable offense. Eileen hung up the phone and waited. She had no idea if anyone would listen to her messages, or even if they did, that her messages would lead to Simon being caught in time. Then she heard the news. Simon had been picked up by Interpol at the Athens airport when he got off the plane. He had definitely gained weight from all the fast food he'd eaten and grew a beard that made him look like a hobo, but it was him. All of the women Simon Leviev had swindled finally received a little bit of justice, but this is not a story with a happy ending. Simon Leviev was sent back to Israel to stand trial for theft, fraud, and forgery. He was sentenced to 15 months in prison. This might seem a little short for how many lives he ruined and how much pain he caused, but it gets worse. Simon was released after 5 months for good behavior. There are people around the world still in massive debt because of the man, and he now walks free on the streets of Israel. When reporters caught up to him and asked him how he felt about the whole experience, he said, "I have the right to choose whatever name I want. I never presented myself as the son of anyone, but people use their imaginations. Maybe their hearts were broken during the process. I never took a dime from them. These women enjoyed themselves in my company. They traveled and got to see the world on my dime." All of which was a bold-faced lie. But did you really expect anything else from a psychopath? His name is still legally Simon Leviev, and when he was released in early 2020, he immediately got back on Instagram where he accumulated 97,500 followers. From what we know, he just started dating Israeli model Kate Conlon just after getting out of jail, which is insane because of what everyone now knows he did to so many women. He continuously takes pictures in fancy cars, designer clothes, and expensive hotels. It's not clear where his new source of income is coming from, but he does have his own company which supposedly gives consultation advice to businesses. We're not sure what makes him qualified to do this, but it seems someone is using his service. So where is his money really coming from? No one knows. Interpol is waiting for him to leave Israel so they can arrest him and try Simon Leviev, as he's now wanted by the authorities in several different countries in Europe. Unfortunately, they are a little too late on bringing up charges against him. There are rumors that the real Leviev family is suing him, and they hope their case will lead to him facing justice to get the sentence he deserves. But like so many other parts of the story, it doesn't seem like this will happen, and Simon Leviev will get away with everything he did. It's estimated he stole around $10 million from women around the world. For the time being, he will remain a free man, while numerous people suffer from the crushing debt they now owe because of him. Cecilia, Pernilla, and Eileen were all victims, but also all heroes, as they each played a major role in the eventual arrest of the psychopathic monster known as Simon Leviev. Now watch My Nice Neighbor, Serial Killer, True Crime, or check out 13 terrifying serial killers you've definitely never heard of.